It was thought, after the development of vaccines and discovery of antibiotics, that man may ultimately be able to overcome all infectious diseases. But this never happened. In fact, for prevention and control of infections, we need to do epidemiological studies and epidemiological interventions. And definitions are critical for any type of epidemiological action, for disease reporting, for disease measuring, for measuring morbidity, and for that we need clear-cut definitions, which will be covered in this lecture, part 1. An infection is called when the infectious agent enters and develops, or enters and multiplies, or both, inside the body of a living being. And once an infection occurs, the body responds in some way to it. It may be in the form of an immune response, or the body may become diseased. But an infection does not always result in illness. The body may be able to fight off the infection and keep it in check, and no clinical illness results. There are various levels of infection, starting from colonization. For example, Staph aureus can colonize the skin and lives in normal nasopharynx also. So it remains at the surface. Second level is subclinical infection or inapparent infection. Infection occurs but no disease results. It happens very commonly in polio. Latent infection. For example, herpes simplex, the infectious agent remains latent in the body and develops into disease whenever the body defenses are low. And finally, the last stage is manifest or clinical infection, when the actual disease occurs due to the infectious agent. Contamination is presence of an infectious agent on the body surface, skin, mucosa, or in clothes, beddings, toys, or on the surface of surgical instruments or surgical dressings and other inanimate articles, and in consumable substances like water, milk, food. So contamination means the infectious agent remains on the surface. It does not mean infection. Pollution is not contamination. Pollution denotes presence of an offensive matter but not necessarily infectious matter in the environment of the living body. Contamination of a body surface. Mere existence of infectious agent on the body surface does not mean the person is a carrier for that infection. We will discuss the carrier state later in this lecture. Infestation. When infestation is used for persons or animals, it means that there is lodgement, development and reproduction of arthropods on the body surface of such a person or animal, or in the clothing. Examples are lice, itch mite, that is scabies. Infestation is also described to say invasion of the gut by parasitic worms. For example, ascariasis is infestation by roundworms. Infested articles or proboscis are those when these harbor or give shelter to animal forms, especially arthropods like cockroaches and mosquitoes or rodents. Host in infectious disease epidemiology means an animal, which can be human, animal, bird, arthropod also, that allows sustenance to an infectious agent under natural conditions. That is, the body of the host is adapted to let the infectious agent enter itself and sustain itself. An obligate host is the only host for that infectious agent. That is, the infectious agent can survive only in that animal species. For example, man in measles and for Salmonella typhi. Some infectious agents require more than one host to complete their life cycle. In such infectious agents, the host in which the parasite accomplishes maturity or spends its sexual stage is by convention called to be the primary host or definitive host. For example, Anopheles mosquito is the definitive host or primary host for malarial parasite. And the host in which the parasite spends its asexual stage or larval stage is considered to be the secondary host or intermediate host. For example, man is a secondary host for malarial parasite. A transport host is a carrier that simply lets the organism survive on itself to be able to carry on to the next host without any kind of development inside its own body. For example, some small fishes that carry the broad fish tapeworm to larger fishes which consume it and are ultimately eaten by larger animals or humans which act as the final host for broad fish tapeworm. An infectious disease is a disease that occurs due to an infectious agent. All infectious diseases, like infestations, are communicable. Infectious disease is communicable and may be either contagious or a non-contagious infectious disease. A contagious infection disease is the disease that spreads from person to person by direct contact. It can be animal to animal or animal and persons by direct contact with the infected individual or their secretion. For example, scabies, trachoma, sexually transmitted diseases, leprosy, etc. So all contagious diseases are infectious disease, but not all infectious diseases are contagious. For example, malaria. For example, food poisoning. Food poisoning can occur because of presence of the infectious agent in the food, but a person does not get it by coming in direct contact with another person who has food poisoning. So what is a communicable disease? It is an illness which occurs due to the presence of an infectious agent or its toxic products, and it arises through transmission of the infectious agent or its products from an infected person or animal or any reservoir to a susceptible host. This transmission can occur either directly or indirectly, that is through an intermediate host or vector or non-living environment. An epidemic is defined as the occurrence in a given community or region of cases of a disease, the number of which is clearly in excess of normal expectancy for that region or community for that part of the year. We say cases of disease or a health related behavior, for example, an epidemic of smoking or other health related event. We mean to say that it's not just disease, can be other thing related to health. The community or region and the period in which the cases arise must be specified precisely. So what is the number of cases which are required when we say that there is an epidemic? That is, this is not the normal number of cases or expected number of cases. They are clearly more than that, and an epidemic is to be declared. That number of cases varies according to the agent, to the population statistics or previous exposure to that disease or lack of exposure to that disease or the time of occurrence. We will discuss in a little detail in the next slide. So epidemicity is comparative to what is usual number of cases for that area among the specified population and for the same season of the year. For example, a disease which has not been seen for a long time, for a number of years in a community, even a single case of that communicable disease is sufficient for declaration of an epidemic. Or a disease which has never been seen in that area. Just 2 cases of such disease which are detected close by together or together in time, that is one after the other, may be sufficient for declaration of an epidemic, because once an epidemic is declared, it requires immediate action and full investigation. So surveillance systems for various diseases have been put in place to identify an unusual number of cases or epidemic as early as possible so that the control measures can be put in place as early as possible. A disease is endemic in a population indicates that the disease is constantly present in that particular population group or geographic areas at some level, and there is no import from outside. The disease, the infectious agent is maintained within that population. In fact, the endemic levels may be considered as the usual level or expected frequency of the disease within that area or within that population group. For example, common cold is endemic in many populations. Now, hyperendemic means that the disease is not only endemic, but at a present constantly at a high incidence or high prevalence and affects all the age groups equally. Holoendemic, on the other hand, the disease is prevalent and the prevalence begins early in life, so that most of the child population gets infected and shows the evidence of disease. And this leads to a state of equilibrium among the adults, that is some degree of immunity among the adults, so that the adult population shows evidence of the disease much less commonly than do the children. An example is malaria in some endemic areas, for example at present northeast areas of our country. An endemic disease can erupt into an epidemic, that is the numbers can rise unusually when the conditions are favorable. For example, hepatitis A can cause an outbreak, typhoid fever similarly. A sporadic disease means that the cases of the disease are seen irregularly or randomly every now and then, usually not that frequent, uncommonly. The cases are infrequent and disconnected in space and time. That is, you see one case here, sometime later one case at another place. There is no connection between any two cases. Hence, a common source of infection cannot be recognized. For example, tetanus, herpes zoster, etc. Sometimes the sporadic cases may actually be the starting point of an epidemic. That is, you see one sporadic case, another doctor reports the same case, which can now be, a connection can be seen either close by or in time. So sometimes sporadic cases may be a starting point of an epidemic. The zoonotic diseases are usually present sporadically. For example, rabies, tetanus. We will talk about zoonotic disease a little later. Pandemic is an epidemic which occurs worldwide, or at least over a very wide area on the globe, crossing international boundaries and usually affecting a large number of people. A pandemic occurs when simultaneous transmission occurs throughout the world. An infectious agent can cause pandemic when it is able to infect and cause disease in the humans, but is also able to spread easily from human to human. And the efforts to control the spread of such pandemic, there is often social turbulence and huge economic losses. The examples recently are COVID-19, pandemic of previous pandemics of influenza and cholera. Zoonoses. Note the E, which means plural, more than one disease. If it is zoonosis with an I, it means a single zoonotic disease. So zoonosis is a disease which can be naturally transmitted from vertebrate animals to man. For example, rabies, plague, bovine tuberculosis, anthrax, etc. Further, anthropozoonoses are infections that can be transmitted to man from vertebrate animals. Example of anthropozoonoses are rabies, plague, hereditary disease, anthrax, etc. Zooanthroposes are the infections which man can transfer to vertebrate animals. For example, cattle handlers, if they have tuberculosis, can transmit human tuberculosis to cattle. And amphizoonoses are infections which are naturally maintained in both the population, man and lower vertebrate animals, and can be transmitted in either direction. For example, Trypanosoma cruzi. An exotic disease is a disease which is not known to occur in that country, but is imported from outside. Epizootic. The name now may suggest that there is a high prevalence of disease in a specified animal population at the specified time. In other words, an epidemic in animal population. Sometimes it may pose a threat to human population also. For example, avian influenza spread through Eastern Mediterranean region in 2006, and large epizoonotics occurred in many countries. Some human infections were also reported from some areas. But only a few zoonotic agents have the capability of causing major epidemics in the human population. Examples of disease with the capability of causing epizoonotic prevalence: anthrax, brucellosis, rabies, influenza, etc. in given animal populations. A pornithic is an outbreak of a particular disease in specific bird population. Zootic, as the name suggests, it is equivalent of endemic disease in given animal populations of a given region during season or climate. In other words, an endemic occurring in animals. Nosocomial infections, also known as healthcare associated infection or hospital acquired infections. Nosocomial infection is an infection acquired during the process of receiving healthcare, which can be a hospital or a smaller or whatever healthcare facility. Nosocomial infection indicates a new illness, that is distinct from the ailment for which the patient was primarily admitted or came to the health facility. And it is called nosocomial infection. It is not only a new illness but was not already present when the patient took admission in the healthcare facility, and is not a residual of the infection for which the patient first reported to the healthcare facility. The symptoms of the infection may appear even after the patient has been discharged. And nosocomial infections also include occupational infections which are acquired by the staff working in the healthcare facility. Example of nosocomial infections: infection of surgical wounds, acquiring hepatitis B during hospital stay, urinary tract infections due to catheterization. Iatrogenic disease. Iatrogenic disease is the result of a diagnostic or therapeutic procedure performed on a patient. In other words, the professional activity generates an adverse health effect. So it can be called as doctor-generated. There are differing views on what constitutes iatrogenesis and its scope, because other professions may also lead to adverse health effects. The iatrogenic disease resulting from the diagnostic or therapeutic procedure may be serious enough to prolong the hospital stay or to require a special new treatment itself, or may actually be life-threatening. Iatrogenic is mostly related to drug therapy reactions or immunization or diagnostic procedures. Examples are allergic reaction to penicillin or vaccines, aplastic anemia due to use of chloramphenicol, childhood leukemia due to prenatal X-rays, etc. In short, iatrogenic disease is a hazard of healthcare. Surveillance. We will talk about surveillance in more detail in epidemiology lectures, but it deserves a mention here because it is regarding a disease, mostly infectious diseases. So the definition of surveillance is continuous analysis, interpretation, and feedback of systematically collected data, generally using methods which are practical, uniform, and rapid rather than accurate or complete. So we observe the trend of the disease by various methods, and we observe the trend of the disease in time, place, and person. Is it increasing in time, with time, or at a place, or in some persons, or in any group of people, is it increasing? By constant surveillance and analysis of data, changes in disease prevalence can be detected or anticipated, and appropriate action can be taken. The appropriate action can be investigation into an epidemic or control measures to be put in place. For surveillance, the data may be collected from the factors. The data may be disease incidence or prevalence or factors which influence the disease prevalence. And the sources of such data can include mortality morbidity records seen from death certificates or hospital records or general practice registers, notifications, etc. Eradication of a disease implies that there is a cessation of all kind of transmission of that particular infection. and that the infectious agent has been removed from the face of earth, and that this has been achieved through constant surveillance and containment of cases. Hence, the term eradication is an absolute term, or we can say an all or none phenomenon. That is, either the infectious agent is present in this world or not. So, the term eradication is to be used only in case of termination of an infection from the entire globe. So, if a disease has been eradicated, it implies that the disease will no longer occur in any population. Till date, 2020, the only disease that has been eradicated is smallpox. When a disease is removed in this way from large area, from a large geographical area, but not from the world, we can use the term elimination. So the term elimination is sometimes used to refer to eradication kind of thing of the disease from a large geographic region or from a political jurisdiction. For example, measles has been eliminated from many countries. And as per the current knowledge, diseases which are amenable to such eradication, which happened with smallpox, are measles, diphtheria, polio, guinea worm, and a few more, which have the potential to be eradicated from the face of earth.